The bedchamber was still warm from the fire when Carenza woke, her body aching in unfamiliar places, her heart swollen with a joy so fragile she was afraid to breathe too deeply. Pale morning light crept through the heavy damask curtains of Ravenscroft Hall, painting gold across silk sheets that still carried the scent of cedar and sandalwood, and something darker she couldn't name. Him, her husband. She reached across the vast bed, fingers searching for the warmth of his body, for the man who had held her through the night with such devastating tenderness that she'd wept against his chest from the overwhelming rightness of it all. Her hand found cold linen. Carenza sat up slowly, clutching the sheet to her bare chest. The fire had burned low, reduced to embers that cast long shadows across the ornate chamber. Her wedding gown lay draped over a chair by the window, ivory silk and seed pearls catching what little light remained, a ghost of yesterday's joy. Corvin stood at the far end of the room, his back to her, still dressed in the clothes he'd worn the night before. His dark hair was disheveled, his shoulders rigid beneath the fine lawn of his shirt. He hadn't slept. She could see it in the tension coiled through every line of his tall frame, in the way his hands gripped the mantelpiece as though he might shatter it. "Corvin?" Her voice came out rough, uncertain. "Is something wrong?" He didn't turn. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of every shade of warmth she'd heard in it last night, when he'd whispered her name like a prayer, when he'd told her she was everything he never knew he needed. "Get dressed." 2 words, cold as the grave. Carenza's stomach dropped. She wrapped the sheet more tightly around herself, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was, how exposed. "I don't understand. What's happened? Is it your mother? Has someone—" "I said get dressed." He turned then, and she saw his face for the first time. The man who had married her yesterday, who had looked at her across the altar of St. George's with such intensity that she'd forgotten how to breathe, was gone. In his place stood a stranger, with eyes like winter ice, his jaw set in a hard line, his beautiful mouth twisted with something that looked horrifyingly like disgust. "Corvin, you're frightening me." "Am I?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound scraped across her skin like broken glass. "How fitting. Tell me, did you and your brother laugh about it together? Did you plan this from the very beginning? Or did the opportunity simply present itself?" "Plan what? My brother? Crispin hasn't—" "Don't." The word cracked through the air like a whip. Corvin crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just short of the bed, close enough that she could see the red rimming his eyes, the evidence of tears he would never admit to shedding. "Don't speak his name to me. Don't lie to me anymore. I've seen the proof. I know everything." Carenza's heart hammered against her ribs. "What proof?" "Corvin, I have no idea what you're talking about. Whatever you think you know. The letters," his voice dropped, dangerous and low. "I found the letters, Carenza, hidden in your trousseau, tucked beneath your wedding night chemise like the sweetest poison. Letters between you and your brother, planning exactly how you would trap me into marriage, how you would use my grief over my father's death to make me vulnerable, how you would secure the Ravenscroft fortune and pay off his gambling debts with my family's money." The world tilted sideways. Carenza stared at him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of words that refused to arrange themselves into meaning. "I never wrote any letters. Crispin would never—" "Stop lying to me!" The roar tore from him with such force that she flinched back against the headboard. She had never heard him raise his voice before. In all the months of their courtship, through every dinner and dance and stolen moment in moonlit gardens, Corvin Blackmore, Duke of Ravenscroft, had been the very portrait of control. That control was gone now. He was shaking, she realized. His hands trembled at his sides. His breath came in ragged bursts, and beneath the fury blazing in his eyes, and she saw something else. Something that made her chest constrict with a pain sharper than fear. He was devastated. Whatever he believed, whatever those letters said, he believed it completely. And it was destroying him. "Corvin!" She forced her voice to steady, forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I don't know what letters you found. I don't know who wrote them or why they were placed among my things. But I swear to you, on my mother's grave, on everything I hold sacred, I did not write them. I would never." Enough. The word fell between them like a blade. "I want you out of this house within the hour. A carriage will take you wherever you wish to go. You will receive a quarterly allowance sufficient for modest living, but you will never set foot on Ravenscroft property again. You will not contact me. You will not contact my family. As far as London society is concerned, you are dead to the Blackmore name." The finality of it stole her breath. "You're casting me out? On our wedding morning? Without even— Yes. You won't even let me explain? Won't let me see these letters and prove they're forgeries?" Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps. Or doubt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the granite hardness of his expression. "The handwriting is yours. The details are things only you would know. You spoke of the scar on my shoulder, the one I received falling from a horse as a child. You spoke of my mother's weakness for candied violets, and how you would use it to win her favor. You spoke of—" His voice cracked, and he looked away, jaw working. "You spoke of the way I hold you in my sleep, the things I whispered to you in the dark." Carenza felt the blood drain from her face. Those details, those intimate, private details that she had never shared with anyone, not even her own brother. How could anyone have known? Unless someone had been watching, listening, waiting. "Someone is doing this to us." She threw off the sheet, modesty forgotten, reaching for him. "Corvin, please, you have to listen to me. Someone wants to destroy our marriage. Someone who knows us both, who had access to—" He caught her wrist before she could touch him, his grip firm but not bruising. For one heartbeat, their eyes met, and she saw it. The ghost of the man who had loved her, the man who had danced with her at the Ashworth ball and told her she was the first thing in years that made him feel alive. Then he released her, as though her skin had burned him. "Be gone within the hour, or I will have the servants remove you by force." He walked to the door, his back straight, his stride measured. A duke even in his destruction. Carenza found her voice just as his hand touched the handle. "I will prove my innocence, Corvin Blackmore. I don't know how, and I don't know when, but I will find whoever did this to us. And when I do, when you do," he said without turning, "I hope you'll have the grace to stay away, because I never want to see your face again." The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than any slam. Carenza stood in the center of the bedchamber that should have been hers, wearing nothing but the flush of humiliation and the remnants of a joy that had curdled into ash. She did not cry. Not when the maid arrived with cold efficiency to pack her things. Not when she dressed in a traveling gown that had been meant for a honeymoon journey to Italy. Not when she walked down the grand staircase of Ravenscroft Hall, past servants who would not meet her eyes. She saved her tears for the carriage, where no one could see them fall, but beneath the grief, beneath the shock and the shame, something else was taking root. Something harder than sorrow, brighter than pain. Someone had done this. Someone had forged those letters, planted that evidence, and destroyed her marriage before it had even begun. And Carenza Blackmore, Duchess of Ravenscroft, for exactly one night, was going to find out who. The carriage rattled through the iron gates of Ravenscroft Hall, and Carenza watched through tear-blurred eyes as the only home she'd hoped to know disappeared behind a curtain of autumn rain. The great house grew smaller and smaller until it was swallowed entirely by the gray mist, a dream she was waking from too suddenly, too cruelly. She had nowhere to go. That was the truth that struck her as the horses turned onto the main road, their hooves splashing through puddles that reflected the leaden sky. Her parents were dead, taken by fever when she was 17. Her brother Crispin had lodgings in London, but they were bachelor's quarters barely suitable for one, let alone two. And even if she could find him, even if she could throw herself on his mercy, the accusation would follow her there. Letters between you and your brother. Crispin, her sweet, foolish, gambling-obsessed brother who could barely manage his own accounts, let alone orchestrate a conspiracy of this magnitude. The idea was absurd, laughable. Except Corvin wasn't laughing, and neither was she. The carriage jolted over a rut in the road, and Carenza pressed her palm against her stomach, fighting a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the motion. Last night, she had been a bride. This morning, she was a pariah. Cast out by her own husband before the ink on the marriage register had fully dried. She had to think. She had to be strategic. First, she needed to see those letters. Whatever forgeries had been planted among her belongings, they were evidence of a crime someone had committed against her. If she could examine them, perhaps she could determine who had crafted them. The handwriting might be similar to hers, but no forgery was perfect. There would be tells, inconsistencies, clues that would lead her to the truth. But Corvin had the letters. Corvin, who wouldn't even look at her as she'd walked out the door. Corvin, who had built a wall of ice around his heart so thick she doubted even dynamite could breach it. Why? The question gnawed at her. Why would someone do this? Who stood to gain from destroying her marriage? The answer came to her slowly, unwillingly, like a splinter working its way to the surface of the skin. Lady Venetia Ashford. Carenza closed her eyes, remembering. Venetia had been the favorite to become the next Duchess of Ravenscroft. She was beautiful, connected, wealthy in her own right, and she had been pursuing Corvin with single-minded determination for 2 full seasons before Carenza had arrived in London with nothing but her modest dowry and her mother's pearls. No one had expected the Duke to look twice at her. Carenza Penhallow was a nobody, the daughter of a country gentleman whose estate had been slowly dwindling for generations. She had no grand connections, no political value, nothing that should have attracted a man of Corvin's stature. But he had looked. More than twice. He had sought her out at every ball, every music hall, and every garden party. He had danced with her when he should have been dancing with heiresses. He had walked with her in the rain when propriety demanded he stay indoors. He had kissed her in the shadow of the Ashworth Conservatory while the rest of society waltzed inside. And he had whispered against her lips that he didn't care about propriety or expectations or anything except the way she made him feel alive. Venetia had watched it all. Carenza remembered the look on the other woman's face when Corvin had announced their engagement. It hadn't been disappointment or even jealousy. It had been something colder, something calculating, the look of a woman who had lost a battle but not yet conceded the war. Could she have done this? Could she have forged those letters, planted that evidence, waited until the wedding night to deliver the killing blow? Yes. The certainty settled into Carenza's bones with sickening weight. Venetia had the resources, the connections, the access. She had been a frequent guest at Ravenscroft Hall during Corvin's courtship of another woman, always smiling, always gracious, always watching with those sharp green eyes that missed nothing. But knowing and proving were 2 different things. Carenza had no evidence, no allies, No standing in a society that would soon learn she had been cast out on her wedding morning. By the time she could mount any kind of defense, her reputation would be in tatters. The carriage slowed, and the driver's voice filtered through the rain. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace. Where shall I take you?" Your Grace. The title landed like a slap. She was still technically a duchess, still technically married. The scandal of an annulment or divorce would take months to arrange, and Corvin had said nothing of it in his fury. Perhaps he intended to simply pretend she didn't exist. Perhaps he thought isolation was punishment enough. Cornwall, she heard herself say. Hartcliffe Cottage, near Falmouth. I have an aunt there. Aunt Perpetua, her mother's elder sister, a widow who had retreated from society decades ago and never looked back. They had exchanged letters over the years, brief and infrequent, but Perpetua had written to Carenza after her parents' deaths with an open invitation. "If you ever find yourself in need of refuge, child, my door is open." Carenza had never imagined she would need to take her up on it. The journey would take days, days of rattling roads and coaching inns, and the endless, terrible solitude of her own thoughts. But it would also give her time to plan, time to think, time to transform her grief into something more useful, something like purpose. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and straightened her spine against the carriage seat. She was still wearing the pearls her mother had given her on her wedding day, the ones Corvin had kissed last night before he'd kissed her. She touched them now, feeling their cool smoothness beneath her fingers. "I will find the truth," she promised silently. "I will prove my innocence, and whoever did this to me will answer for it." The rain continued to fall, gray and relentless, as the carriage carried her away from everything she had hoped for and toward an uncertain future. But somewhere behind her, in a great house shrouded in mist, her husband stood at the window of their bedchamber, holding a bundle of damning letters in hands that would not stop shaking. He did not know it yet, but the first crack had already appeared in his certainty. A hairline fracture in the ice around his heart, thin as a spider's thread, but just as persistent. She had sworn on her mother's grave. Carenza had loved her mother more than anything in this world. Everyone who knew her knew that. She had worn mourning for 2 full years, had visited the grave weekly until she'd moved to London, had spoken of her mother with such tender reverence that even Corvin's own stoic heart had softened. Would she truly invoke that sacred bond for a lie? He crushed the thought before it could take root. She was clever. Of course she was clever. That was part of how she'd trapped him, wasn't it? Making him believe she was different. Making him believe she saw him, not just his title and his fortune, but him. Corvin threw the letters into the fire and watched them burn, watched the elegant handwriting curl and blacken and crumble to ash. He told himself it was closure. He told himself he was glad she was gone. He told himself the hollow ache in his chest was rage, nothing more. But when his valet found him an hour later, still standing at the window, still staring at the road, where the carriage had long since vanished, even the servants could see that something in the Duke had broken, something that might never be repaired. Hartcliffe Cottage was not a cottage at all, but it had been named by a woman who considered anything smaller than a manor house to be modest accommodation. The stone building sat on a cliff overlooking the sea, battered by salt wind and softened by decades of climbing roses that had long since gone wild. Carenza arrived at dusk, exhausted beyond measure, her traveling dress wrinkled and her spirit worn thin as paper. Aunt Perpetua met her at the door. She was not what Carenza remembered. The woman who had attended her parents' funeral had been stiff with grief, formal and distant. A stranger in black who had pressed coins into Carenza's palm and told her to write if she ever needed anything. This woman was something else entirely. White hair loose around her shoulders, bare feet on the cold stone floor, a paint-stained smock covering a dress that had clearly been fine once and was now merely comfortable. "So," Perpetua said, looking her niece up and down with eyes the same gray as the Cornish sky. "He threw you out, did he?" Carenza blinked. "How did you—" "Your face tells the whole story, child. A woman doesn't arrive on my doorstep looking like the world has ended unless a man has done something unforgivable." Perpetua stepped aside, gesturing her into the warmth of the cottage. "Word will spread soon enough, if it hasn't already. For now, come in before the damp settles into your bones." The cottage interior was chaos given form. Books stacked on every surface, canvases propped against walls, some finished, some abandoned mid-stroke. A fat ginger cat sprawled across a velvet settee that had seen better centuries. The smell of turpentine and dried herbs, and something savory bubbling in a pot somewhere. It was the opposite of Ravenscroft Hall in every conceivable way. Carenza felt something loosen in her chest. "Someone forged letters," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Made it look like I was plotting with my brother to trap him for his money. He believed them. He didn't even give me a chance to explain." Perpetua guided her to a chair by the fire, pressing a cup of something warm into her hands. Not tea, Carenza realized after the first sip. Something stronger. Something that burned pleasantly on the way down. "Men are fools," Perpetua said matter-of-factly, settling into a chair across from her. "Especially men who've never had to fight for anything. Your Duke was handed everything from birth. Title, fortune, privilege. When something challenges his understanding of the world, he doesn't know how to wrestle with it. Easier to destroy than to question. He's not my Duke anymore, isn't he?" Perpetua's eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement, or might have been challenge. "You're still wearing his ring." Carenza looked down at her hand. The gold band with its single ruby, the Ravenscroft family stone, still circled her finger. She hadn't even thought to remove it, hadn't wanted to. "I should take it off." "Should you?" "Why?" "Because he cast me out, because he called me a liar and a schemer, and said he never wanted to see my face again." "And what do you believe?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "I believe someone did this to us deliberately," Carenza said slowly. "I believe I am innocent, and I believe the truth matters. I believe—" She trailed off, staring into the fire. "Go on, child. I believe he loved me." The words hurt to say. Before this, before whoever did this poisoned everything, I believe what we had was real, and I don't understand why it was taken from us. Perpetua nodded slowly. "Good. That's important. Hold on to that, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful." She rose, moving to stir whatever was bubbling on the ancient stove. "You can stay here as long as you need. Cornwall is good for healing. The sea has a way of scouring things clean." "I don't want to heal." The words came out fiercer than Carenza intended. "I want to fight. I want to find whoever did this and make them answer for it." Her aunt turned, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Now that sounds like your mother." Something softened in Carenza at the mention. "You knew her well?" "I knew her better than anyone." Perpetua brought 2 bowls to the small table by the fire, fragrant stew and crusty bread that made Carenza's empty stomach clench with sudden hunger. "Morwenna was fierce, your mother. When she decided something was unjust, heaven help anyone who stood in her way. She would have marched straight back to London and torn that Duke apart with her bare hands. And what would you do? If you were me?" Perpetua considered the question while they ate. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, the sea crashed against the cliffs with relentless rhythm. "I would wait," she said finally. "Not long, not passively, but strategically. The truth has a way of surfacing when liars get comfortable. Whoever did this believes they've won. Let them celebrate. Let them lower their guard. Meanwhile, gather your strength, write to your brother, find out what he knows, and watch. Watch for what? For cracks in their story, for moments when their mask slips, for allies you don't yet know you have." Perpetua's eyes were sharp despite her gentle tone. "You said your husband burned the letters? I don't know. He might have. If he did, that's telling. A man who truly believed in your guilt would keep the evidence. A man who destroys it." She shrugged. "Perhaps he's already doubting, even if he won't admit it to himself." Carenza thought of Corvin standing at the fireplace, his hands shaking. She thought of the way his voice had cracked when he'd spoken of the intimate details in those letters, the things she had never shared with anyone. She thought of the way he'd released her wrist, as though her touch burned him. Not because he hated her, because he was afraid of what he might feel if he let himself keep touching her. "He'll come," she heard herself say. "Eventually, when the truth comes out, when he realizes what he's done, he'll come. And what will you do then?" The question sat between them like a stone. Carenza didn't know, couldn't imagine forgiving what he'd done, the way he'd looked at her, the things he'd said. But she also couldn't imagine a future that didn't include him somehow. Couldn't imagine her heart belonging to anyone else, even now, even broken as it was. "I suppose," she said quietly. "That depends on how he asks." The fire crackled. The cat stretched and yawned. Outside, the wind carried the salt tang of the sea through every crack and crevice of the old cottage. Carenza Blackmore, Duchess of Ravenscroft in name if nothing else, finished her stew and began to plan. She would write to Crispin first thing in the morning. She would ask him to investigate quietly, to find out what he could about who had access to her belongings before the wedding. She would make a list of everyone who might want to destroy her marriage and examine each possibility with cold, careful logic. And she would wait. But not forever. Somewhere in London, in the great houses where gossip traveled faster than scandal, Lady Venetia Ashford was celebrating her victory. She didn't know it yet, but she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Because Carenza Penhallow had learned patience from her mother, strategy from her father, and stubbornness from the granite cliffs of her Cornish ancestors, and she had absolutely no intention of staying exiled for long. 3 weeks passed in Cornwall, each day bleeding into the next with the rhythm of tide and wind. Carenza rose with the sun, walked the cliffs until her legs ached and her mind cleared, then returned to the cottage to help Perpetua with whatever task needed doing. Mending nets for the fishermen's wives who came by for her aunt's herbal remedies, grinding pigments for Perpetua's paintings, reading aloud from the novels that arrived monthly from a bookseller in Truro. It was a small life, a quiet life. It was slowly driving her mad. "You're pacing again," Perpetua observed from her easel, where she was attempting to capture the stormy light that preceded evening. "You've worn a track in my floorboards. I'm thinking. You've been thinking for 3 weeks. Perhaps it's time to stop thinking and start doing." Carenza turned from the window, where she'd been staring at the gray horizon. "Crispin's letter arrived this morning." Perpetua set down her brush. "And? He's investigated as best he could. No one remembers seeing anyone suspicious near my trousseau before the wedding. The seamstresses, the maids, the footmen who carried the trunks to Ravenscroft Hall, none of them noticed anything unusual." Carenza pulled the letter from her pocket, the paper already soft from repeated reading. But he did discover something interesting. Lady Venetia Ashford was seen leaving the servants' entrance of Ravenscroft Hall 2 days before the wedding. She claimed she was delivering a gift for the Dowager Duchess, but the Dowager never received any gift. So she had access to the house, and potentially to my belongings, if she bribed the right servant. Carenza's fingers tightened on the letter. But it's not proof, it's speculation. Crispin says half of London believes I'm guilty, and the other half simply doesn't care. The Duke has retreated entirely from society. He sees no one, attends nothing. His mother is apparently beside herself. And how does that make you feel, knowing he's suffering too? The question cut deeper than Carenza expected. She moved to the fire, holding her hands toward the flames, though she wasn't truly cold. I don't know, she admitted. Part of me is glad. He deserves to suffer for what he did, for refusing to listen, for throwing me away like I was nothing. But another part, she swallowed. Another part remembers the way he looked at me on our wedding day, like I was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. I don't know how to reconcile those two men, the one who loved me and the one who destroyed me. Perhaps they're the same man, Perpetua said quietly. People contain multitudes, child. The capacity for great love and great cruelty often live side by side. Before Carenza could respond, a knock sounded at the cottage door. Not the gentle rap of the village women who came for remedies, but something more insistent, more urgent. Perpetua raised an eyebrow. Were you expecting someone? Carenza's heart lurched. For one wild moment, she imagined Corvin standing on the other side of that door, rain-soaked and repentant, ready to beg forgiveness on his knees. But when Perpetua opened the door, it was not Corvin. It was a woman Carenza had never seen before. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in traveling clothes that were elegant but practical. Her face was striking rather than beautiful, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of strong tea. I'm looking for Carenza Blackmore, the woman said, the Duchess of Ravenscroft. Carenza stepped forward, every instinct on alert. I'm Carenza. Who are you? The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded as though confirming something to herself. My name is Honoria Blackmore. I'm the Duke's cousin, and I've come to help you destroy the woman who ruined your marriage. Meanwhile, 200 miles away, Corvin Blackmore was drowning. Not in water, but in silence. In the echoing emptiness of a house that had once felt like home and now felt like a mausoleum. Every room held memories. The library where he'd first told Carenza about his father's death, the garden where he'd proposed, his voice shaking with a vulnerability he'd never shown anyone. The bedchamber where he'd held her through the night, where he'd whispered promises he'd shattered before dawn. He couldn't escape her. He'd tried. God, how he'd tried. He'd thrown himself into estate business, spending hours with ledgers and correspondence until his eyes burned. He'd ridden out every morning, pushing his horse to exhaustion, hoping physical fatigue would silence the thoughts that wouldn't stop circling. It didn't work. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Not the face of the schemer he'd convinced himself she was, but the face of the woman who had woken on their wedding morning with such radiant joy, reaching for him across the sheets. The woman who had sworn on her mother's grave. He'd burned the letters. He told himself it was to destroy the evidence of his humiliation, but that wasn't the truth. The truth was that he couldn't bear to look at them anymore, couldn't bear to see her handwriting, so familiar and yet suddenly foreign, spelling out a betrayal that made no sense, because it didn't make sense. That was the splinter that had worked itself deep into his brain, festering despite his best efforts to ignore it. Carenza was clever, yes, but the letters weren't clever. They were clumsy, obvious, exactly the kind of evidence a suspicious husband would find damning. If she had truly been plotting against him, would she really have been so careless? Would she have hidden such incriminating documents in a place he would inevitably discover? And Crispin Penhollow, Corvin had met the man twice, briefly during the courtship. He was a gambler, yes, constantly in debt, frequently foolish. But there had been genuine affection between him and Carenza. She had spoken of him with fond exasperation, the way one speaks of a wayward puppy, not a co-conspirator. "Your Grace." His valet's voice cut through the spiral of his thoughts. Corvin looked up from the brandy he'd been staring at without drinking. "What is it, Marsh?" "Your mother requests your presence in the drawing room. She says it's urgent." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft had been requesting his presence with increasing frequency since Carenza's departure. Corvin had avoided her successfully for weeks, but his mother was nothing if not persistent. "Tell her I'm indisposed." "She anticipated you might say that, Your Grace." Marsh's expression remained perfectly neutral. "She asked me to inform you that if you do not come down willingly, she will come up, and she will bring Lady Venetia Ashford with her." Corvin's blood turned to ice. "Venetia is here?" "She arrived an hour ago, Your Grace. She and her mother. The Dowager has been entertaining them." Of course she had. His mother had never hidden her preference for Venetia as a match. She was suitable in every way Carenza had not been. Wealthy, connected, and pedigreed. His mother had accepted Carenza only because Corvin had insisted, and now that the marriage had collapsed, now his mother was circling like a vulture, ready to pick the bones clean and present him with a more appropriate replacement. "Tell my mother," Corvin said slowly, "that I will join her in 10 minutes. But if Lady Venetia is still present when I arrive, I will have her removed from the premises by force." Marsh's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Very good, Your Grace." After the valet departed, Corvin stood at the window, looking out at the rain that had been falling for days. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray curtain of weather, Carenza was living her life without him. Hating him, probably, as she should. But something Marsh had said nagged at him. Lady Venetia had arrived, uninvited, unannounced, barely 3 weeks after the scandal, while all of London whispered about the Duke's disastrous marriage, while any respectable woman would have maintained a discreet distance. Venetia had come running. Why? The question followed him down the stairs, through the corridors, into the drawing room where his mother sat with perfect posture and fury in her eyes. Venetia was gone. "Small mercy. You have avoided me long enough," his mother said. "Sit down, Corvin. We need to talk about what happens next." "Nothing happens next." "Don't be absurd. You can't simply wallow in this house forever. The annulment proceedings need to begin. You need to re-enter society. I need to be left alone." "What you need," his mother said sharply, "is to accept that you made a mistake, marrying that fortune-hunting nobody, and move forward." Venetia has been incredibly gracious about the whole situation. She understands that men sometimes lose their heads over unsuitable women. She's willing to forgive and forget. "There's nothing to forgive. I was never promised to Venetia. But you could be. Now. She would make an excellent Duchess, Corvin. She has breeding, connections. She understands the responsibilities of your position. She makes my skin crawl." The words landed like a slap. His mother's composure cracked for just a moment. "You're being dramatic." "I'm being honest. Something I should have been from the start." Corvin moved to the fireplace, unable to sit while his thoughts churned. "There is something wrong about this whole situation, Mother. The letters, the timing, the way everything fell apart so conveniently." "Conveniently? You were betrayed by a scheming fortune hunter. There's nothing convenient about that." "Wasn't there?" He turned to face her. "Think about it. Carenza had nothing to gain by being caught. If her goal was truly to secure my fortune, she would have been far more careful. She would have destroyed any evidence. She wouldn't have left damning letters hidden in a place I would inevitably search. His mother's expression hardened. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that perhaps the letters weren't written by Carenza at all. That perhaps someone wanted me to believe she had betrayed me. Someone who stood to gain from the destruction of my marriage. The silence that followed was deafening. That's ridiculous, his mother said finally. Who would do such a thing? But something flickered in her eyes, something that looked almost like fear. And Corvin, who had spent his whole life reading the subtle cues of aristocratic deception, saw it clearly. His mother knew something. Honoria Blackmore sat in Perpetua's cluttered parlor like a raven among songbirds, her dark elegance stark against the comfortable chaos. The ginger cat had taken an immediate dislike to her and retreated to the kitchen, hissing. "You'll forgive me if I'm suspicious," Carenza said, not moving from her position by the fire. "The last Blackmore I trusted destroyed my life." "Corvin didn't destroy your life. Venetia Ashford did." Honoria accepted the cup of tea Perpetua offered, without taking her eyes off Carenza. He was merely the weapon she wielded. "And you know this how?" "Because I've been watching Venetia for years. Because I know what she's capable of." Honoria's jaw tightened. "And because she did the same thing to me." Carenza's breath caught. "What?" "5 years ago, I was engaged to a baron's son, Cedric Harlow. We were desperately in love, planning our wedding, utterly besotted with each other." Honoria's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled almost imperceptibly around her teacup. Venetia wanted him. Not because she loved him, but because his family's land bordered property she intended to acquire. When she realized he preferred me, she forged a series of letters suggesting I had been conducting an affair with his brother. Dear God. Cedric believed them, just as Corvin believed the letters about you. He called off our engagement publicly, humiliated me before all of society, and 3 months later announced his engagement to Venetia. Honoria's smile was bitter as ash. She discarded him within a year, of course. Once she had what she wanted, he was useless to her. The last I heard, he'd retreated to the continent and hadn't been seen in England since. Perpetua had gone very still by her easel. "And you never exposed her?" "I tried. No one believed me. I was the jilted woman, bitter and vengeful. Venetia was sweet and beautiful and had powerful friends." Honoria set down her teacup with careful precision. "But I never stopped watching, never stopped gathering evidence. And when I heard what happened to you, Duchess, when I heard that history was repeating itself with my own cousin as the victim, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer." Carenza's mind raced. "What evidence do you have?" "Letters written by Venetia herself, in her own hand, to a forger in Whitechapel, who specializes in recreating handwriting. Testimony from a maid she dismissed last year, who witnessed her practicing signatures. Financial records, showing payments to individuals, who later provided false testimony against me." Honoria reached into her traveling case and withdrew a leather portfolio. "It's not enough to convict her in a court of law, but it might be enough to convince Corvin of the truth. Why should I care about convincing Corvin of anything?" Carenza heard the bitterness in her own voice and didn't try to soften it. "He threw me away without a second thought. He called me a liar and a schemer. He didn't even have the decency to question whether the evidence might be false. Because he was afraid. That's not an excuse. No, it's not." Honoria met her eyes steadily. "But it is an explanation. My cousin has never handled vulnerability well. His father's death nearly broke him. He spent months drowning in grief, unable to function, terrifying everyone who loved him. When he finally emerged from that darkness, he was different. Harder. More controlled. He swore he would never let himself feel so deeply again. And then I came along. And then you came along." Honoria agreed. And you made him feel everything he'd been suppressing for years. The love he'd denied himself. The happiness he didn't believe he deserved. And when Venetia handed him proof that it was all a lie, that he'd been a fool to let down his guard, he chose to believe the worst because it was easier than being hurt again. Yes, Carenza turned away, staring into the fire. Her chest ached with emotions she couldn't name. Grief and rage and something else, something that felt horrifyingly like understanding. She didn't want to understand. She wanted to hate him cleanly, purely, without the complication of compassion. Even if what you say is true, she said finally, it doesn't change what he did. The things he said to me. The way he looked at me like I was something filthy on the bottom of his shoe. No, it doesn't. Honoria rose, moving to stand beside her. But here's the question you need to answer, Duchess. What do you want? I want justice. I want Venetia to pay for what she did. Is that all? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I want, Carenza started, then stopped. The words caught in her throat. Say it. I want him to know the truth. I want him to understand what he threw away. I want him to feel even a fraction of the pain he caused me. Her voice broke on the last word, and she hated herself for it. I want him to suffer. And after he's suffered, after he knows the truth and feels the pain, what then? Carenza couldn't answer, because the truth was too complicated, too contradictory. She wanted him to hurt, but she also remembered the way he'd held her on their wedding night, the way he'd whispered her name in the darkness like it was the only word that mattered. She wanted justice, but she also wanted him, and she didn't know how to reconcile those two desires. You don't have to decide now, Honoria said gently, but you do have to decide what kind of enemy you want to be, one who strikes from the shadows and disappears, or one who faces her accusers directly and forces them to see the truth? Before Carenza could answer, the sound of hoofbeats reached them through the rain, fast hoofbeats, approaching at speed. Perpetua moved to the window. Someone's coming, a single rider. Carenza's heart stopped. For one terrible, hopeful moment, she thought. Corvin. He's found me. He's come. But the man who dismounted in the rain, who tied his horse to the cottage gate and stumbled toward the door with wild eyes and muddied clothes, was not her husband. It was Crispin, and from the look on his face, something had gone terribly wrong. Crispin Penhollow had ridden through the night. His coat was soaked through, his fair hair plastered to his skull, his handsome face gray with exhaustion, and something worse. Fear. The kind of fear that turned men into boys and stripped away every pretense. Carenza. He stumbled through the door, nearly collapsing into her arms. Thank God. Thank God you're alive. Crispin, what's happened? What are you doing here? She knows. His voice cracked. Venetia knows you're investigating her. She came to my lodgings 2 nights ago with threats. Said if you didn't stop digging into her affairs, she would make sure I hanged for forgery. What? The letters, Carenza. The ones that destroyed your marriage. Crispin's eyes were wild, darting around the cottage as though expecting Venetia to materialize from the shadows. She's prepared another set. Letters that make it look like I was the mastermind. Like I forced you into the scheme, coerced you, threatened you. She says if she presents them to the Duke, he'll have me arrested and tried for fraud against the peerage. Honoria stepped forward. That's not how the law works. Forgery of that nature. It doesn't matter how the law works, Crispin rounded on her. It matters what people believe, what the Duke believes. If Venetia convinces him that I'm the true villain, he'll use every ounce of his power to destroy me. And he has a great deal of power. Carenza's blood ran cold. She knew Crispin was right. Corvin in his current state, grieving and guilty and desperate for someone to blame, would seize any explanation that absolved Carenza of culpability. And if that explanation required destroying her brother, "We have to move faster," she said. "We need to expose Venetia before she can act." "With what?" Crispin laughed bitterly. "We have suspicions and hearsay. She has the ear of every powerful family in London. She's been weaving her web for years, Carenza. We're flies who've only just realized we're trapped." "Not quite." Honoria held up her portfolio. "I have documentation of her past crimes, enough to plant doubt, if not prove guilt outright. But you're right that we need more. We need someone who was present when she forged the letters. Someone who helped her." Perpetua had been silent through this exchange, watching with those calm gray eyes that missed nothing. Now she spoke. "Then you need to find her forger." All eyes turned to her. Honoria mentioned a man in Whitechapel, a specialist. If Venetia used him to create the letters that destroyed Carenza's marriage, he'll have records. Criminals always keep records, insurance against the day their employers turn on them. "How do we find him?" Crispin asked. "The same way you find anyone in London's underworld. You pay someone who knows." Perpetua's smile was surprisingly sharp for a woman who supposedly lived in peaceful retirement. "I wasn't always a hermit, children. Before your mother married your father, Carenza, before I became respectable, I had a rather colorful past. I still know people who know people." Carenza stared at her aunt. "You never told me. Some stories aren't meant for letters." Perpetua moved to her writing desk, pulling out paper and ink. "I'll write to an old friend in London. He owes me several favors, and he has connections in every rat's nest from Cheapside to Seven Dials. If anyone can find Venetia's forger, it's him." As Perpetua wrote, Carenza found herself drifting to the window. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, and the first stars were beginning to pierce the cloud cover. Somewhere out there, beyond the cliffs and the sea and the miles between them, Corvin was living his life without her. Did he think of her? Did he lie awake at night, haunted by doubt? Or had he successfully convinced himself that casting her out was righteous, that his cruelty was justified? She closed her eyes, and memory washed over her. Their first dance at the Ashworth ball. She hadn't expected him to notice her. She'd been standing at the edge of the room, overwhelmed by the grandeur, and acutely aware of how shabby her gown looked compared to the confections surrounding her. Then a voice, low and warm, had spoken beside her. "You look like you're planning your escape." She'd turned to find the Duke of Ravenscroft watching her with something like amusement. Everyone had told her he was cold, forbidding, still wrapped in mourning for his father. But his eyes were kind, and his smile, when it finally emerged, transformed his austere face into something beautiful. "I was considering the window," she'd admitted, "but the drop looks rather unforgiving." "It is. I tried it once as a boy, broke my arm in 2 places. He'd offered his hand. Dance with me instead. It's safer, and the company is better." She danced with him, and then again, and then a third time, sending ripples of scandal through the ballroom. A duke didn't dance 3 times with a nobody, unless he intended something. Corvin had intended everything. The memory shifted. Walking in the garden at Ravenscroft Hall, just days before the wedding, he'd been telling her about his father, about the last conversation they'd had before the illness took hold. "He told me not to make his mistakes," Corvin had said, his voice rough. "He said he'd spent too much of his life being proper, being careful, being what everyone expected. He said when I found something real, I should hold on to it with both hands and never let go." "And did you find something real?" He'd stopped walking then, turning to face her in the dappled sunlight beneath the oaks. "I found you," he'd said, "and I have no intention of letting go." Carenza opened her eyes, and tears were streaming down her face. "Here." Perpetua pressed a handkerchief into her hands. "Cry if you need to. It's not weakness. It's just the heart doing its work." "I hate him," Carenza whispered. "I hate him so much." "Yes, and I love him. Still. Even after everything." "Yes. How do I make it stop?" Perpetua was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice gentle as the sea at dawn. "You don't, child. You just learn to carry it. And maybe, if you're lucky, you find a way to set it down someday. Not to forget. Never to forget. But to put it somewhere it doesn't crush you." Crispin appeared beside them. His panic subsided into exhausted determination. "Perpetua's friend will find the forger, and when he does, we'll have what we need to bring Venetia down." "And Corvin?" Carenza asked. "That depends on him." Honoria had joined them, her dark eyes thoughtful. "I've sent word through my own channels. My cousin will soon receive information that will make him question everything he believed. What he does with that information is his choice." "What information?" Honoria smiled grimly. "A letter from me, detailing what Venetia did to me 5 years ago. Detailing the patterns, the methods, the victims." She paused. "And asking him one simple question. A question I think will haunt him." "What question?" "I asked him whether he truly believed that the woman who wept at her mother's grave every Sunday for 2 years, who wrote letters to her dead parents on every birthday and anniversary, who spoke of love and loss with more genuine feeling than anyone I've ever known, would use that sacred bond to tell a lie." Carenza's breath caught. "He told me about that," Honoria continued. "During your courtship, he told me he'd never met anyone who loved as fiercely as you did. Anyone who felt as deeply. He said it was what drew him to you in the first place." Her expression softened. "And I'm betting that when he reads my letter, when he's forced to confront that memory, he won't be able to reconcile the woman he loved with the villain Venetia painted. It might not be enough. No. But it's a start." Honoria moved toward the door. "I should find lodgings in the village. Tomorrow we plan our next move." She departed into the misty night, leaving Carenza with her brother, her aunt, and the terrible weight of hope. Because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain and the rage that still burned in her chest, Carenza found herself clinging to Honoria's words. "He told me he'd never met anyone who loved as fiercely as you. Maybe that memory would reach him. Maybe it would crack through the ice he'd built around his heart. Or maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe some wounds couldn't be healed. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt." But as she stared out at the stars emerging through the clouds, Carenza made herself a promise. She would find the truth. She would destroy Venetia. She would clear her name and her brother's. And then, only then, would she decide whether Corvin Blackmore deserved a second chance. The answer might be no, but she was beginning to hope it might be yes. Honoria's letter reached Ravenscroft Hall on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who refused to identify his employer. Corvin found it waiting on his breakfast tray, the seal unmarked, the handwriting familiar enough to make his stomach clench. He almost burned it unread. But something stayed his hand. Perhaps it was the sleepless nights that had hollowed him out, leaving him raw and questioning everything. Perhaps it was the conversation with his mother 3 days prior, the flicker of fear in her eyes that she hadn't been able to hide. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the kind that stripped away pride and left only desperate hunger for truth. He broke the seal. Honoria's words were precise, unflinching, devastating. She wrote of Venetia's past crimes, of forged letters and ruined engagements, of a pattern so clear that Corvin felt physically ill as he read. She wrote of evidence gathered over years, of witnesses silenced and paid off, of a woman who treated lives as chess pieces to be sacrificed for her ambitions. And then came the question, do you truly believe that Carenza, who wept at her mother's grave every Sunday for 2 years, who wrote letters to her dead parents on every birthday and anniversary, who loved with such fierce devotion that even you, in your armored grief, recognized it as something rare and precious, do you truly believe she would invoke that sacred bond to tell a lie? The letter fell from Corvin's nerveless fingers. He couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt around him, walls closing in and ceiling pressing down. Every certainty he'd clung to for the past month was crumbling, and beneath it was the memory of Carenza's face on their wedding morning, the joy in her eyes, the way she'd reached for him across the sheets, the absolute devastation when he'd thrown his accusations at her like stones. I swear to you on my mother's grave, she had said that. He remembered now, remembered every word of that terrible confrontation with perfect, excruciating clarity. She had sworn on her mother's grave, and he had ignored it, had believed the letters instead, had believed Venetia's carefully constructed lies instead of the woman who had shown him nothing but honesty from the moment they'd met. Your Grace? Marsh stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. Lady Venetia Ashford has arrived. She insists on speaking with you. Corvin's blood turned to ice, then fire. Show her in. He didn't know what he intended until Venetia walked through the door, her smile bright, her gown perfectly arranged, her green eyes gleaming with triumph she didn't bother to hide. She moved toward him as though they were already intimate, as though his wife's exile had cleared a path straight to his bed. Corvin, darling, I came as soon as I heard about your mother's gathering. I know it must have been difficult, having to explain your situation to everyone, but how did you know about the letters? Venetia stopped mid-step. I beg your pardon? The letters I found in Carenza's trousseau, the ones that proved her guilt. Corvin watched her face with the focus of a predator scenting blood. I never told anyone what was in them. Not my mother, not my valet, not a single soul. I burned them the morning after I cast her out. So how, Lady Venetia, did you know their contents well enough to discuss them with half of London? Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, quickly suppressed. People talk, Your Grace. Servants gossip. I merely heard. You heard specific details. The scar on my shoulder. My mother's fondness for candied violets. Intimate moments between my wife and myself that no servant could have witnessed. He advanced on her, and for the first time he saw her composure crack. Those details were in the letters, only in the letters, letters that I burned. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm accusing you. Corvin's voice was deadly quiet. You forged those letters. You planted them among Carenza's belongings. You destroyed my marriage before it had even begun, and you did it because you couldn't stand losing to a woman you considered beneath you. Venetia's mask shattered. She was beneath you. The words exploded from her, ugly with venom. A nobody from nowhere, with nothing to recommend her but a pretty face and a talent for playing the innocent. You were supposed to be mine, Corvin. I waited years for you, cultivated your mother's favor, positioned myself perfectly. And then that little fortune-hunting whore waltzed in and stole everything. So you admit it. I admit nothing. Venetia regained control with visible effort, her face smoothing back into its customary sweetness. You have no proof. Your cousin's accusations are the ravings of a bitter spinster who never recovered from losing her own fiancé. Any court in England would laugh at your claims. Perhaps. Corvin moved to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was not just Marsh, but also his mother, his solicitor, and 2 constables from the local magistrate. All of them had heard every word. Venetia went white as snow. You should know, Corvin said quietly, that while you were confessing your crimes to me, my cousin was presenting evidence to the magistrate in London. Evidence that includes testimony from the forger you employed in Whitechapel, who was more than willing to cooperate once he learned you intended to make him a scapegoat. That's impossible. I paid him. Not enough, apparently. Corvin stepped aside as the constables entered. Lady Venetia Ashford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, forgery, and criminal interference in the marriage of a peer. I suggest you go quietly. Venetia's screams of protest echoed through the halls of Ravenscroft as she was dragged away. His mother watched in shocked silence, her face ashen. The solicitor began speaking about legal proceedings and public statements. Corvin heard none of it, because the only thought in his mind, drowning out everything else, was a single devastating realization. He had cast out an innocent woman. He had destroyed his marriage, broken his wife's heart, thrown away the only real happiness he'd ever known, all because he'd been too afraid to trust. And now, he had to find her. Now, he had to beg for a forgiveness he didn't deserve. Marsh, his voice came out hoarse. Prepare my horse. I'm leaving within the hour. For where, Your Grace? Cornwall. He was already moving, already calculating distances and travel times. My wife is in Cornwall, and I have a great deal to answer for. The road from Ravenscroft to Cornwall was long, muddy, and merciless. Corvin rode through the first night without stopping, pushing his horse until the animal trembled with exhaustion, and he was forced to trade for a fresh mount at a coaching inn outside Bristol. He slept for 3 hours in a chair by the fire, then rose before dawn and continued west. He didn't know what he would say when he found her. Every speech he composed in his mind sounded hollow, inadequate. How did one apologize for what he had done? What words could possibly bridge the chasm he had created? I was afraid. I was a coward. I believed lies because the truth was too terrifying. Because loving you meant I could lose you, and losing you would destroy me. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But he had to try. On the second day, as he crossed from Devon into Cornwall, the landscape began to change. Rolling hills gave way to dramatic cliffs, gentle farmland, to wild moors dotted with standing stones and ancient ruins. The air tasted of salt and rain, and the sky stretched overhead in endless shades of gray. This was where she had fled. This remote, beautiful, harsh corner of England. She had come here to escape him, to heal from the wounds he had inflicted. What right did he have to intrude on that healing? None. The answer was immediate and absolute. He had no right. He had forfeited every claim to her when he'd thrown her out of their marriage bed without even allowing her to defend herself. But he couldn't stay away. Couldn't live with himself knowing the truth and not telling her. Couldn't spend another day haunted by the memory of her face, pale and shocked, as he'd called her a liar and a schemer. The third day brought him to Falmouth, where a tavern keeper directed him toward Hartcliffe Cottage with a suspicious look that suggested he wasn't the first stranger to come asking. "The Duchess, is it?" The man's voice was protective. "She's been through enough without more trouble from London." "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm her husband." I know who you are." The tavern keeper's expression hardened. "The whole village knows what you did to her. Cast her out on her wedding morning, they say. Left her with nothing but shame and a carriage ride to nowhere." Corvin flinched. "I was wrong. Were you now? I was manipulated, deceived. The woman who forged the evidence against my wife has been arrested and will stand trial for her crimes." He met the man's eyes steadily. "But none of that excuses what I did. I should have believed Corenza. I should have trusted her. I didn't, and I've come to face the consequences of that failure." The tavern keeper studied him for a long moment. Whatever he saw must have satisfied something, because he finally nodded. The cottage is 2 miles north, on the cliffs overlooking the sea. But I'll warn you, Your Grace, the Duchess has friends here now, people who care about her. If you've come to cause more pain, you won't find Cornwall hospitable. I understand. Corvin rode the last 2 miles with his heart pounding against his ribs. The cottage appeared through the mist like something from a fairy tale. Stone walls covered in climbing roses, smoke curling from the chimney, windows glowing warm against the gray afternoon. He dismounted, tied his horse to the gate, and stood there for a long moment. This was it. The moment that would determine his future. Either she would hear him, or she wouldn't. Either she would forgive him, or she wouldn't. Either way, he would finally know. He walked to the door and knocked. Footsteps inside, the sound of a bolt being drawn, and then the door opened, and he found himself face to face, not with Carenza, but with an older woman whose gray eyes held the weight of decades. "You must be the Duke," she said calmly. "You'd better come in. She's not here." His stomach dropped. "Where is she?" "Walking the cliffs. She does that when she needs to think." The woman stepped aside, gesturing him into the cottage's cluttered warmth. "I'm Perpetua, her aunt. And you, Your Grace, have a great deal of explaining to do before I let you anywhere near my niece." Carenza saw him from the cliff top. She had been walking for hours, trying to quiet the chaos in her mind after Honoria's latest message. Venetia had been arrested. The forger had confessed. Her name was cleared, her innocence proven beyond any doubt. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the edge of an abyss, waiting for the ground to crumble beneath her feet. Because clearing her name changed nothing. Corvin had still believed the worst of her, had still looked at her with disgust and called her a schemer, had still thrown her out of his house, his life, his heart, without a moment's hesitation. And now, impossibly, he was here. She recognized his horse first, the distinctive gray stallion he'd ridden when they'd courted. Then she recognized his silhouette in the cottage doorway, tall and familiar and devastating. He was speaking with Perpetua, his posture rigid, his hands tight at his sides. Part of her wanted to run, to flee down the other side of the cliff, to hide until he gave up and left. But she was done running, done hiding, done being the woman who absorbed other people's cruelty without fighting back. She descended the path toward the cottage with deliberate slowness, giving herself time to compose her features into something resembling calm. By the time she reached the garden gate, Corvin had emerged from the cottage and stood waiting for her. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, hollows in his cheeks that hadn't been there a month ago, mud on his boots, and travel dust on his coat. He looked like a man who had ridden across England without stopping, without sleeping, without caring for anything except reaching his destination. Good, some vicious part of her thought. Let him suffer, Carenza. Her name in his mouth was a wound and a prayer. Please, let me explain. Explain what? She kept her voice flat, emotionless. That you realized the woman you trusted over your own wife was a criminal? That you finally bothered to investigate before condemning me? I should have believed you. I know that. I knew it even then, somewhere beneath the fear and the rage. But I was a coward, and I let myself be manipulated, and I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me. Yes. She walked past him toward the cottage door. You did. Carenza, please. No. She spun to face him, and all the control she'd been maintaining shattered. You don't get to please me, Corvin. You don't get to ride in here with your apologies and your regrets and expect me to fall into your arms like nothing happened. Do you have any idea what you did to me? I'm trying to understand. You can't understand. You've never been powerless in your life. You've never had someone you trusted completely look at you like you were garbage. You've never been thrown out of your own home, your own marriage, with nothing but the clothes on your back and the shame burning in your chest. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her voice cracking on every word. I loved you. I gave you everything I had, everything I was, and you threw it away. Not because of anything I did, but because you were too much of a coward to believe in me. Because trusting me was too frightening, and it was easier to believe I was a villain than to risk being hurt. Corvin's face was gray. You're right. I know I'm right. You're right about all of it. I was a coward. I'm a coward. I've spent my entire life protecting myself from feeling too deeply because I watched my father nearly die of grief when my mother passed. I swore I would never be that vulnerable. And then you came along, and you made me feel everything I'd been suppressing for years. And when Venetia handed me an excuse to push you away, you took it. I took it. His voice broke. And I will regret it until the day I die. Whether you forgive me or not, whether you ever speak to me again, I will carry the weight of what I did to you forever. Carenza stared at him through her tears. Part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her remembered the man who had danced with her at the Ashworth ball, who had proposed in the garden at Ravenscroft, who had held her on their wedding night like she was something precious. But another part, the part that had been shattered and slowly rebuilt over these past weeks, refused to yield. It's not enough, she said quietly. Words aren't enough. Not after what you did. Then tell me what would be enough. Tell me what I can do. I don't know. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. I don't know if there's anything you can do. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Corvin. You didn't just break my heart. You broke my faith. In you, in marriage, in the possibility of being loved without being destroyed. The silence between them was vast and terrible. I'll stay, Corvin said finally, for as long as it takes. I'll stay in Cornwall. I'll prove myself in whatever way you require. I'll spend years earning back what I threw away if I must. But I won't give up, Carenza. I can't. Because living without you isn't living at all. That's not your decision to make. No, it's not. He stepped back, giving her space. But I'm asking you, begging you, to give me the chance to try. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when the wounds have healed enough to let you breathe. Give me the chance to show you who I can be, who I should have been from the beginning. Carenza looked at the man who had destroyed her, who had come across England to beg for her forgiveness, who stood before her now with nothing but hope and desperation. Find lodgings in the village, she heard herself say. Don't come back here until I send for you. I will. I'll wait as long as you need. I know. She turned toward the cottage door. That's exactly what you're going to do. She closed the door behind her, and only then did she let herself collapse against it, sobbing for everything she had lost, and everything she might, impossibly, be beginning to hope she could regain. Corvin stayed. He took a room above the tavern in Falmouth, paid a month in advance, and settled in to wait. The villagers regarded him with suspicion at first, this London duke who had treated their adopted duchess so cruelly. But his days turned to weeks, as he remained humble and patient, and showed no signs of trying to force his way back into Carenza's life. Their hostility began to soften. He helped the fishermen mend their nets when storms kept them ashore. He assisted the blacksmith when a cart axle needed replacing and an extra pair of hands was needed. He sat in the tavern's common room and listened to old sailors tell tales of smugglers and shipwrecks, and he asked questions about Cornwall's history and customs as though genuinely interested. Because he was. This was Carenza's home now. These were her people. If he was to have any hope of winning her back, He needed to understand the world she had built for herself in his absence. Word reached him through the village gossip that she had begun teaching reading to the fishermen's children, that she helped Perpetua prepare herbal remedies for the sick and elderly, that she walked the cliffs every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, always alone, always lost in thought. He didn't approach her, didn't try to engineer accidental meetings. He simply existed in her orbit, visible but not intrusive, letting his presence speak where words had failed. After 2 weeks, Crispin Penhollow found him. "You look terrible," Crispin observed, settling onto the tavern bench across from him, which is appropriate, given the circumstances. "You came to gloat?" "I came to deliver a message." Crispin's expression was unreadable. "My sister doesn't know I'm here. She'd probably kill me if she did. But I've been watching you, Ravenscroft. We all have. And what have you concluded? That you're either genuinely repentant, or you're the finest actor I've ever seen." Crispin signaled for 2 ales. "My money's on genuine. No man would muck out stables and haul fishing nets for 3 weeks if he didn't mean it." Corvin's jaw tightened. "I would do far more than that." "I know. That's why I'm here." Crispin leaned forward. "Carenza won't admit it, but she watches for you. Every time she walks the cliffs, she looks toward the village. Every time someone mentions your name, she goes very still and pretends not to listen. She's not as indifferent as she wants to be." Hope, fragile and terrifying, sparked in Corvin's chest. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that words failed you once. Don't rely on them again." Crispin slid a folded paper across the table. "This is a list of things that matter to Carenza, things she dreams of, but would never ask for. I'm not saying you should buy her forgiveness. I'm saying you should show her you actually know who she is." Corvin unfolded the paper. The list was written in Crispin's careless scrawl. A library of her own. Not borrowed, not temporary. Her mother's portrait, which was sold to pay debts, and now hangs in a collector's home in Bath. The freedom to make her own choices, without depending on anyone else's goodwill. A home that belongs to her, where no one can cast her out. "These aren't small things," Corvin said slowly. "No, they're not. But you're a duke with limitless resources and a lifetime of wrongs to make right." Crispin stood, draining his ale. "Figure it out." He left Corvin alone with the list and the weight of everything it represented. It took another week to arrange. He tracked down the collector in Bath and bought back the portrait of Morwenna Penhollow for 3 times what the man had paid. He commissioned a solicitor to draw up papers that would transfer ownership of Hartcliffe Cottage to Carenza absolutely and irrevocably, along with an income sufficient to maintain it regardless of what happened to their marriage. He purchased 400 books from the finest booksellers in London and had them shipped to Cornwall with instructions for a local carpenter to build shelves to house them. He did all of this without telling her, without seeking credit or acknowledgement. When the portrait arrived at the cottage, there was no note. When the legal papers were delivered, they came from the solicitor's office with no indication of who had initiated the transfer. When the books began arriving in crate after crate, the only accompanying document was a catalog listing each title. Carenza would know it was him. There was no pretending otherwise. But he wanted her to understand that this wasn't about buying forgiveness. It wasn't about grand gestures designed to sweep her off her feet. It was about giving her back everything she had lost, everything he had the power to restore. It was about proving, through action rather than words, that he finally understood who she was and what she deserved. And then he would wait, for as long as it took. Carenza stood in the cottage library, surrounded by books. 400 volumes lined the new shelves that had appeared one morning while she was walking the cliffs. Poetry and philosophy, novels and histories. everything she had ever mentioned wanting to read in all their conversations during their courtship. He had remembered. Every casual comment, every wistful glance at a book she couldn't afford. He had remembered it all. Her mother's portrait hung above the fireplace. Morwenna Penhallow looked down at her daughter with gentle eyes and a knowing smile, exactly as Carenza remembered her. She had wept for an hour when it arrived, clutching the frame to her chest like a child reunited with a lost treasure. The papers on the table confirmed what Perpetua had already told her. Heartcliff Cottage was hers, not borrowed, not dependent on anyone's goodwill. Hers, absolutely and forever, along with an income that would ensure she never had to rely on another person's charity again. He had given her freedom. After everything he had taken, he had given her the one thing she had always wanted and never dared to ask for: independence, security, the ability to choose her own life without fear. "He's at the tavern," Perpetua said from the doorway. "Has been for 3 weeks now. Hasn't tried to see you once since that first day." "I know. The fishermen like him. Say he works hard and doesn't complain. Old Thomas says he's the best net mender they've had in years." Carenza almost smiled. Corvin mending fishing nets. His mother would have an apoplexy. Probably. Perpetua moved to stand beside her, looking up at the portrait. "Your mother was always the brave one, you know. When everyone told her to marry safely, marry well, she chose your father because he made her laugh. When the money ran out and the world fell apart, she held the family together through sheer force of will. She never let fear make her choices for her. I'm not afraid. Aren't you?" Carenza turned away from her mother's painted eyes. "He destroyed me. Perpetua. He took everything I offered him and threw it back in my face." "Yes. And now he's trying to rebuild what he destroyed. The question is whether you'll let him." "Why should I?" "Because you love him." Perpetua's voice was gentle. "Because despite everything, despite all the pain and betrayal, you never stopped loving him. And because holding on to rage is exhausting, child. It eats you from the inside. Eventually, you have to choose. Forgive or don't forgive, but choose deliberately. Don't let fear make the decision for you." The words hit Carenza like a wave, knocking the breath from her lungs. Fear. She had been so focused on her anger, her hurt, her righteous indignation, that she hadn't recognized the fear underneath. Fear of being vulnerable again. Fear of trusting and being betrayed. Fear of loving someone who had the power to destroy her. But she was already destroyed. He had done his worst, and she had survived. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of their marriage, stronger and more resilient than before. What power did fear have over her now? "Send for him," she heard herself say. "Tell him to come to the cottage. Tonight." Perpetua nodded and disappeared without another word. Carenza spent the remaining hours pacing, thinking, and rehearsing what she would say. By the time Corvin knocked on the cottage door, she had abandoned all her careful speeches and decided to simply speak from the heart. Whatever happened, happened. She opened the door. He looked better than he had 3 weeks ago. Still tired, still worn, but there was color in his cheeks and calluses on his hands that hadn't been there before. He had been working, actually working, not playing at it. "Thank you for seeing me," he said quietly. "Come in." They stood in the library, surrounded by the gifts he had given her, the portrait of her mother watching over them both. "Why?" Carenza asked finally. "Why all of this? The books, the portrait, the cottage. Why give me everything I ever wanted when I haven't given you any reason to hope?" "Because you deserve it." His voice was steady. "Because I took so much from you, and I wanted to give something back. Because even if you never forgive me, even if you send me away tonight, and I never see you again, I wanted you to know it. I finally understand." who you are, what matters to you, what I should have seen from the beginning. And what should you have seen? That you are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. That you love with your whole heart and your whole soul, holding nothing back. That you are braver than you know and stronger than you believe. That I was a fool to ever doubt you, and I will spend years trying to be worthy of you if you let me. Carenza felt tears sliding down her cheeks. I don't know if I can trust you again. I know. I don't know if the wounds will ever fully heal. I know that too. But, she took a shaking breath, I don't want to let fear make my choices anymore. I don't want to spend years wondering what might have been if I'd been brave enough to try. Hope blazed in his eyes. Carenza, I forgive you. The words came out barely above a whisper. I forgive you, Corvin. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry this rage any longer. Because my mother taught me that love is worth fighting for. Because despite everything you did, I never stopped loving you, and I'm tired of pretending I did. He moved toward her slowly, giving her time to retreat, to change her mind. When she didn't move, he reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. I love you, he said. I have loved you from the moment you told me you were considering escaping through the window at the Ashworth ball. I will love you for every breath I have left and beyond. And I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, I will never doubt you again. I will never let fear come between us again. I will spend every remaining day earning the gift you've just given me. He kissed her. It was nothing like their wedding night kiss, which had been heated and desperate. This was tender, careful, a promise made flesh. When they finally broke apart, Carenza was laughing and crying simultaneously. We have a great deal of work to do, she said. Rebuilding trust, learning to communicate, proving that this time will be different. I know. He pressed his forehead against hers. And I am ready for all of it, however long it takes. It might take forever. Then we'd better get started. 6 months later, the ballroom at Ravenscroft Hall blazed with candlelight, filled to bursting with the cream of London society. Everyone who was anyone had come to witness what the gossips were calling the reconciliation of the season. The Duke and Duchess of Ravenscroft, together again, hosting their first public event since the scandal that had nearly destroyed them. Carenza descended the grand staircase on Corvin's arm, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that matched the Ravenscroft family jewels at her throat. The whispers started immediately, a susurrus of speculation and curiosity, but she paid them no mind. Let them talk. She had learned something important during her exile in Cornwall. Other people's opinions were just noise. What mattered was the truth, and the truth was this. She loved her husband. He loved her. They had walked through fire together and emerged stronger. Nothing anyone said could touch that. Ready? Corvin murmured. Always. They took the floor for the first waltz, and the crowd fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The public declaration of their reconciliation, the final chapter in a story that had captivated society for months. They're staring, Carenza said. Let them. Corvin smiled down at her, and there was nothing cold or controlled in his expression now. Just love, pure and unguarded. They'll get bored eventually. Will they? No, probably not. He spun her through a turn and she laughed. But I've discovered I don't care anymore. About society, about appearances, about any of it. The only opinion that matters to me is yours. And what if my opinion is that you look ridiculous when you try to be romantic? Then I would say you're lying, Because I am extremely romantic and you adore it." She did. She absolutely did. As they danced, Carenza caught glimpses of familiar faces in the crowd. Crispin, cleaned up and actually employed now as Corvin's unofficial investigator, chatting with a pretty blonde who seemed entirely charmed by his roguish smile. Honoria, severe and elegant in dark blue, watching over the proceedings with something like satisfaction. Perpetua, who had been persuaded to leave Cornwall for the first time in decades, arguing animatedly with the Dowager Duchess about something that was making them both laugh. Even the Dowager had softened. She would never admit to being wrong about Carenza, but she had publicly welcomed her back into the family and privately apologized for her role in what she called that unfortunate misunderstanding. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Lady Venetia Ashford was notably absent. She had been convicted of forgery and fraud, stripped of her social standing, and exiled to a distant relative's estate in Yorkshire, where she would spend the rest of her days in obscurity. Justice, delayed, but finally delivered. The waltz concluded. Corvin bowed, Carenza curtsied, and the crowd erupted into applause. "Speech!" someone called, and others took up the cry. Corvin looked at Carenza, eyebrow raised. She nodded. He turned to face the assembled guests, keeping her hand firmly in his. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. As you know, the past year has been eventful for my wife and myself. There were moments when I doubted whether we would survive. Moments when I wondered if I had destroyed the greatest gift I've ever been given." The room was utterly silent. But my wife taught me something important. She taught me that love is not about perfection. It's not about never making mistakes. It's about choosing, every single day, to fight for the person who matters most. To be honest, even when honesty is painful. To trust, even when trust feels impossible. He lifted her hand to his lips. "I am the luckiest man in England. Not because I was born a duke, or because I inherited wealth and privilege. I am lucky because this woman, this fierce, brilliant, loving woman, chose to give me a second chance. I will spend my days trying to deserve it." Carenza's eyes were bright with tears. She turned to face the crowd, her voice clear and strong. And I learned something too. I learned that walls don't protect you. They only keep out the people who want to love you. I learned that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the bravest thing you can do. And I learned that home isn't a place. She looked up at her husband. Home is a person. The applause that followed shook the chandeliers. Later, after the guests had departed and the servants had begun cleaning up, Corvin led Carenza to the library. Their library, filled now with both his father's collection and the books he had sent to Cornwall. "I have something for you," he said. "Another gift? You're spoiling me. I plan to spoil you for years to come." He handed her a small velvet box. "Open it." Inside was a key, simple brass, worn smooth with age. "What does it open?" "The East Wing." He smiled at her confusion. "I'm having it converted into a school, for the village children, and for anyone else who wants to learn. Reading, writing, arithmetic, whatever subjects you wish to teach." He cupped her face in his hands. "You gave those fishermen's children a gift in Cornwall. Now you can give it to everyone." Carenza threw her arms around him, laughing through fresh tears. "You impossible, wonderful man." "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes. Completely and irrevocably, yes." He kissed her, and she melted into him. And outside the library windows, the first snow of winter began to fall on Ravenscroft Hall. They had been through fire and ice, through betrayal and forgiveness, through exile and homecoming. They had been broken and rebuilt, stronger for the mending. And now, finally, they were home. Every year, on the anniversary of their reconciliation, Corvin and Carenza returned to Cornwall. They stayed at Hartcliffe Cottage, walked the same cliffs where she had wept and raged and slowly healed, and remembered how close they had come to losing everything. And every year, without fail, they stood together at the edge of the cliff where Carenza had first seen Corvin waiting at the cottage door, the day he had come across England, to beg for her forgiveness. "Do you remember what you said to me that day?" Corvin asked the first time they returned. "I told you to find lodgings in the village and not come back until I sent for you. And I did." "You did." She leaned into him, feeling his arm wrap around her shoulders. "You actually listened to me. I think that was when I knew." "Knew what?" "That you had changed, that you were willing to wait, that you weren't going to force your way back in, but let me come to you when I was ready." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I would have waited forever." "I know." She smiled up at him. "That's what made it possible to forgive you. It became their tradition, their pilgrimage, their reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, even the most shattered trust could be rebuilt, if both people were willing to do the work." And whenever someone asked the Duchess of Ravenscroft how she had known, really known, that her husband had changed, she always smiled and said the same thing. He stopped trying to control the outcome. He just showed up, day after day, and let his actions speak. He gave me back my freedom, and trusted that I would use it to choose him. It was, she thought, the greatest gift he had ever given her, the knowledge that she was finally, completely, irreversibly home. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because there was nowhere else she wanted to be.